Hello, friends. This is Seth Itzkan of Soil for Climate. I hope you're doing wonderfully well. And let me see. Start. We should be starting. Okay, there we go. Hello, friends. This is Seth Itzkan of Soil for Climate. I hope you're doing wonderfully well. And we're going to have an exciting discussion today with soil champion turned congressional candidate Nicolette Hahn Niman. Um, she's a real hero of mine, and I've known her for a while, and just a champion and sort of in every level. That is, she's a producer producing grass-fed meat. She's a lawyer, an environmental a lawyer. She's a proficient writer. She worked at the Atlantic, writing some stories that we're going to talk about, and she's published numerous books. And she just ran, excuse me, for political office for the second congressional district in California. So there's going to be a lot to talk about. Um, let me stop this share and I'm going to show some more overview slides. But first of all, let me say hello, Nicolette. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Seth. Good to be here.
And so, Nicolette, what I'm going to do right now, just real quick, is just show some slides. Um, just from PowerPoint that that we had talked about earlier, just to sort of give the overview of of the scope of your work, which has just been so exciting over the years, and you're a proprietor with Neiman Ranch. We can talk more about that. I've had the pleasure of visiting. You're the author of basically two amazing books, but one book, Defending Beef, has two editions. You can talk more about that. And then also, of course, the Reich's Porkchop. And you're a writer with The Atlantic, and I love the little write up that they made about you. And then here, just an example of some of your articles. And and I love the fourth one there about bees and free range beef. It's funny, these articles are 15 years old, but they're completely relevant today. So would love to hear more about that as well. And then, of course, you just ran for Congress, California's second district, and I want to hear more about your thoughts about that. And then here just some press about your run for Congress. Oh, and then of course you're in the movie Groundswell, which also just came out, which is the third movie in the Kiss the Ground trilogy of Kiss the Ground, Common Ground, and Groundswell. So okay, so enough of PowerPoint. Let's stop the share, and and let's just so pick it up wherever you want to in terms of the arc of everything I just laid out, and then uh, people should people on Zoom feel free to ask questions in the chat area. I believe there's a question and answer area as well. It's possible I might not have turned that on. That would be my own mistake. But feel free to ask questions in the chat area. Okay, Nicolette, please. The floor is yours. Talk about whatever you want.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of a conversation about this stuff. There's so much to discuss, as you've just alluded to. Um, I guess the thing that I'm really excited about is the idea that there is a national conversation that has emerged in the last few years, I would say, much more so than when I started working on all of this. It was over 20 years ago. And and it was really hard to find people kind of in the general public that had a real awareness about certainly soil, but also just sort of food and sustainability and the connection between agriculture and human health. There are a lot of topics that are kind of on the table of the stuff you just mentioned. Um, and I feel like all of those topics, we are just in a very different place right now than we were, 20 years ago. And the Kiss the Ground films, as you just mentioned, are one of the reasons for that, because we've really needed um, ways to get into the sort of the general public's consciousness and to get this on the kind of on the radar screen. I still feel like the area where we're really not making that much progress is that national policy level. And so, although I have worked on that, and I know you have, Seth, and many people have, um, I feel like there's still a just a real deficit there. And when Tim Ryan was running for the Democratic nomination for president several years back, he was actually making, um, sort of making an issue of the food system and the connection between agriculture and human health. And I was very excited about that at that time, but it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of picking up on that from other candidates for, national office. And just having I wouldn't say concluded the race because they're still counting the returns, but it looks very unlikely that I would end up in the top two in the primary for California's second district. So I will most likely be done with my candidacy here shortly. Um, but I will say that as part of that campaign, I've been paying a lot more attention to, you know, not just the race I was in, but also other um, elections that were happening, including the California governor's race. And these issues were practically absent, I would say, and that's discouraging. Okay, so there's a lot of work to be done on the policy side. Um, but as far as consumer interest and awareness, it's so often the case that elected officials are really far behind where the public consciousness is. So I feel like the public consciousness is much further along than 20 years ago. The national policy discussion is still not very far down this road. Although, Seth, as you know, there's a lot happening in state legislatures. I think there's that often is a place where leadership kind of happens on legislation. There's certainly good examples of soil legislation that's either been proposed or passed. There's pretty good soil legislation here in California. And so I think, again, we're kind of slowly but surely making progress on these issues, but there's a lot of work to be done.
So, what were the top two or three talking points in your campaign?
Well, this is a very unusual district. Okay, I don't know how many people on this call would be aware of the details of this, but without getting too far into the weeds, um, California was one of those states that kind of got involved in that, sort of arms race about the redistricting to try to create more seats. And so for the Democrats or the Republicans, it was happening on both sides of the aisle in red states and blue states where governors were pushing forward some tactic to try to create more seats that would to try to claim the majority or protect the majority in the US House of Representatives. So in California, this was actually done through something called Proposition 50, which was very strongly backed by Governor Gavin Newsom. This was very controversial because in California, you actually have, despite a large number of Republicans living in the state, you had only they're pretty dispersed and they're especially in rural areas that are not very heavily populated. So you had only nine out of 52 congressional members that were Republicans, and with Proposition 50, that would be reduced to four. So there were five additional seats that were being redistricted, attempting to make them Democratic seats. So one of the districts that got affected by this was the district I live in, actually, and that's District 2. And this is actually where I live is a democratically drawn district, and it was redrawn to take some of the votes away to create another Democratic seat because this seat um, was rated plus 40 Democrat. That's how many points a Democrat would be expected to win this seat based on the demographics. The redrawing changed that to plus 20, so it was still very high, but it was a little bit more open, but it took a lot of the Democratic seats and gave them to um, another district. But also, in order to sort of balance this out, it added three Republican counties to this district. So those are very rural areas. And actually, as it turns out, it is kind of why I ended up running for Congress, because I was really concerned in our immediate community. I felt that our representative, Congressman Jared Huffman, who's just finishing up his seventh term here, um, he's not someone who's ever, in my opinion, placed any real value on agriculture or things like food or soil or any of this stuff that you and I are so focused on. And so I was already quite concerned about his particular focus and his approach, which, in my view, is much more of a um, view of environmentalism that I don't think is very helpful, because it's very much about nature but not humans, nature without humans, kind of an exclusionary kind of approach. And I actually think it's kind of an outdated view of environmentalism, because I view humans as a really important part of good environmental stewardship and care of the planet and care of soils. You need humans in the equation, absolutely. So in any case, I ended up running for this congressional seat because of the fact that these three additional counties were being added, and those are very rural and very agricultural. So to answer your question, the issues I was discussing varied a lot depending where I was in the district. Um, this is the largest district in California now, and one of the largest congressional districts in the entire country. So it's a vast area. A lot of it is agricultural, especially in the very northern part. It goes all the way up to the border of Oregon and all the way over to the border of Nevada. And in especially that area, people were very interested in talking about agriculture, and in particular also timber and wildfire. So that is kind of the daily reality that people are dealing with there. And, sort of down where I live, which is much more urbanized, Marin County. I mean, we can literally see San Francisco from where I live. From our ranch, you can literally see San Francisco, as you might remember, Seth, from when you visited here. Um, this is an area where people are much more likely to be talking about things like, you know, more typical issues like that people in urban areas are discussing, things like the cost of healthcare and cost of living and housing affordability and things like that. So depending on where I was, what we were discussing was very, very different. Um, my focus, I'll just say, was on this idea that we need to focus in every congressional district much more on the issues of the individual communities, and rather than being so focused on sort of national, hot button issues that are being talked about in the national media and in Washington D.C. with within maybe the parties, and on social media, et cetera, that we really need to focus on what's needed in the individual communities, and rebuilding community economies and sort of community scale conversations about what's needed in that region for people to have good jobs and to be able to afford to live there. And so it's just a really different approach. And that's something that we were talking about throughout the entire campaign. And when Senator Ben Sass was interviewed on 60 Minutes about 6 weeks ago or so, I felt really validated in the approach I was taking, because it was exactly what he was talking about in that interview. Just the need to sort of refocus on community-wide, community level conversations and work to try to make communities be able to be livable and affordable and economically vibrant again.
And how spin that back to talking about soil and agriculture and environmentalism.
Well, one thing that I've experienced a lot in, I've lived here for 23 years now, and I've heard, where I live, the part of California that I live in, you would say that any person you encounter on the streets is very likely to consider themselves to be an environmentalist. And they would be the kind of person who might have supported an organization like Sierra Club or, that kind of thing. And they would think that environmental sustainability is a very important virtue and a really important task for all humans. However, they wouldn't be necessarily that focused on, and I would say that a little bit less about where I live, West Marin, which is actually agricultural and rural. But for most of this county, which is more urbanized, people are not thinking about it from an agricultural or soil perspective. They're much more likely, they might be thinking about climate change. They might be thinking about cars. Maybe they're thinking about, sort of smokestack emissions, that kind of thing. But they're not really connecting that very much to food and soil health. And so a lot of what I was kind of encountering everywhere I went was, if you were in a rural area, they would hear the word environmentalism and they would get a little bit nervous because in these more rural parts of the district, there's a lot of litigation that they're facing from environmental groups. And so it made me feel like I needed to have a conversation where I was talking about environmental values as something that is something that they themselves are living, and um, good forest management, good land management, good care of the earth, good care of soils, good care of agricultural lands and grazing lands. um, that's something that I've always felt. I talk about it in my books a lot, that people that are actually practicing those professions often have the deepest knowledge of the conditions of wherever they're living, and and the issues related to sort of stewardship, basically. Um, and then when I was sort of in the more urban areas, the environmentalism that I'm encountering there, everywhere, this has been true for years, but including on this campaign, um, it's much more of an idea that's sort of crafted by the messaging from national environmental groups. And so there isn't this thought necessarily about how it relates to their immediate community and the stewardship that the people that are working the lands are providing. So one of the things that's happening right here in my local community as well is there's a really vibrant fishing community in Bolinas where I live, and the people here are in the community are very supportive of the local fisher people and of that activity. But then there's a local environmental group that had recently brought a petition to shut down the access for the local fishermen to that area where they fish. So there's this strange disconnect that I still see happening in all these different contexts between the idea of environmentalism and then how do we make that happen in the real world. And so um, my passion, which has been the case for years, but including in this recent congressional campaign, is the idea that we need to focus on good stewardship rather than excluding, people from the land or from the water, and and how do we get to a more sort of nuanced understanding of environmental, stewardship.
Nicolette, thank you so much. And let me just also inform you that more people are coming in both on the Zoom and on the Facebook. So we're streaming into Facebook, and so I'm sort of keeping my eye on both channels. And let me just do a quick share again for people who are just joining now of the um, of the PowerPoint. Just really quickly, just to remind people again, and who are just joining, we are talking to Nicolette Hahn Niman, a real champion in many regards for soil health, production policy, and communications. and she's the author of numerous books and is also proprietor of Niman Ranch. And you can see these books that she has written: Defending Beef, Rice's Porkchop, and all about taking a much more nuanced ecological perspective on meat production. And she was also a writer for The Atlantic and really wrote some incredible stories. And I do want to ask you about this story here toward the end: A Way to Save America's Bees, Buy Free Range Beef. So let's make sure we have time to get to that. And and then you recently ran for Congress. That's what you were just talking about. And then also you're in the movie Groundswell, which also just came out. So that's all very exciting. Um, and I want to tell people to please ask your questions, either in the chat, in Zoom, or in the Facebook group, and I'll try to relay them. In the meantime, Nicolette, tell us quickly how you went from, I mean, it shouldn't even need to be explained. It should just sort of be obvious that if you're an environmentalist and environmental attorney, that you're also in favor of, good land husbandry using animals. But most people don't get that at all. So help
Right.
us help us understand your own evolution in that regard.
Yes, I will. And I just want to quickly say my husband, Bill Niman, is the founder of the Niman Ranch Meat Company and spent many years building it up and was the CEO for many years. But we're not connected with it anymore. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Okay,
Um,
thank you.
but in any case, well, my own evolution on it is a little bit like I think a lot of other people. I had the sort of typical experience in college where you're an environmentalist and you're interested in, being a good steward or being doing your part, being a good citizen. And that's when I decided to stop eating meat myself because at that time, and I was a biology major, and I was involved in the college environmental group, and there was a lot of stuff out there saying that if you cared about the environment, that you wouldn't be eating meat, and especially you wouldn't be eating beef. And so
Right.
years later, when I went to work for Waterkeeper Alliance, and as their senior attorney, and the work was really focused on the environmental impact, the negative environmental impact from large concentrated animal operations, it actually kind of initially reinforced my own perspective that meat was environmentally problematic. But it also kind of became the beginning of my journey to really understand it in a very different way and to really think of animals not just as not inherently environmentally problematic, but actually an essential part of sort of the solution, and the movies you were just highlighting, the Kiss the Ground trilogy, um, those are such a beautiful, sort of visual portrayal of this whole idea that we really need to focus on when we talk about good environmental stewardship. It's actually much more about sort of creating complex systems that mirror nature. And I really appreciated the fact that that point was sort of made over and over again in those films. And that were, and I've gotten to spend some time over the years with Gabe Brown, who's very prominently featured in those films as well. And he does such a great job in his book, Dirt to Soil, as well, sort of highlighting this whole idea that what you're trying to do in a sort of conventional agricultural system is you're really focusing on output and input, and it's a very simplistic mindset of sort of, here's your cost, here's your input, and here's your output, and you're trying to minimize your costs and maximize your output, and it's very kind of linear in its approach. And in fact, you can't really do that with agriculture because agriculture is, obviously functioning in the natural environment. And the beauty of the system is that it is a system and there's complexity to it. And everything is interrelated. And so you can't just have a kind of, as the what I quote in Defending Beef, I quote the philosopher Fritjof Capra, who also I've heard speak in person and I've met in person, and he has a whole book about systems. And the whole the whole thing that he said that I heard him say in person was that really clicked in my mind is only human built machines operate in that linear way, sort of A leads to B, which leads to C, because in a natural environment and in a natural system, everything is connected and everything is a system rather than a linear sort of mechanical sort of A leading to B leading to C. So for me, in when I wrote Defending Beef, it was the first time that I really sat down and thought about soil, for example. And I had just sort of a vague concept of all of this at that point, but I had already been part. Um, I think you mentioned it in introducing me. When I married Bill Niman, that's when I moved to the ranch here in California, and I had studied environmentalism. I had been an environmental lawyer, but it wasn't until I lived on our ranch that I really had a much deeper understanding of how interconnected everything is and how, if you want to produce food in an environmentally sound way, the the whole key is to try to mimic an ecosystem, and an ecosystem is always a complex system. So actually in the groundswell film, I was really glad they used a quote from me and it did a little graphic about it, how in nature you always have this three-part equation, which is plants, animals, and fungi, and they always work together. And people, when they hear the word fungus or fungi, they tend to think of, a mushroom, and those are obviously fungi. But um, when you start studying soil, you learn that actually there's this unbelievable. First of all, you have so much happening on the microscopic level, and you also have this whole below ground system. The mycelium, I've heard you talk about it many times, Seth, and I discuss it in Defending Beef as well. You have this sort of below ground, incredibly intricate, connected network that is sort of the highway of the soil ecosystem, the subterranean ecosystem. And so the fungal part of it, a lot of times, is out of view of the human eye. And especially in conventional agriculture, there's been no thought at all, I think, about the importance of that part of the three-legged stool. So my own journey, sort of where I got to thinking about animals as absolutely essential parts of vibrant, healthy planet, vibrant, healthy food systems as part of that, is because when I started really researching this for my books, I started to see the many, many ways that you had this three-part system over and over again in a natural environment. And you could do this in an agricultural system, but that the conventional agricultural systems were not doing that. In fact, the plowing and the application of agricultural chemicals again and again is disrupting that system. And so it's not only not functioning that way, but it's actually harming that natural system that's constantly regenerating itself and creating healthy plants because it's getting the nutrients into the growing plant, through the as mediaries between the soil and the plant, et cetera. So at this point, today, I view this as absolutely foundational that you need to have the grazing animals because grazing animals are able to um, protect and maintain that vegetative cover on the earth, which is absolutely essential for um, soil health, for maintaining the moisture below ground, maintaining the biological activity of the soil, and because an enormous portion of the earth, more than half of it, is these basically rangelands that will not be healthy if they don't have that animal impact, as the Savory Institute people are always saying. And so you need the grazing animals. And then they also produce not just food, but meat and milk are the most nutrient dense, most bioavailable foods that humans can eat. And we have a kind of a, and sort of an epidemic level of um, diet-related diseases, sort of chronic diseases around the world, but especially in the industrialized world. And so you need more of that kind of food. You need, and especially grass-based meat and milk. And so on the, on this sort of parallel tracks, you need to have that kind of food available for humans, and you need to have that kind of impact on the earth to have a healthy planet.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Thank you. And I want to use that as a segue to now talk about this article that you wrote 15 years ago, but is still completely relevant today, as far as I can tell. So I'm doing a share from the Atlantic website itself of articles that you wrote while you were with the Atlantic. I want to know more about that. How did that even happen? How did you become a writer for the Atlantic? But just and I don't even know when the last time was you even looked at your own page on the Atlantic. I mean, they have a very nice page with your content there. But you got to tell us about this story right here: a way to save America's bees, buy free range beef. And of course, you need to log in to read the whole story. But I love this thing right here. As the insects that pollinate our crops disappear, comma, a team of scientists has learned that they thrive on land grazed by cattle. So let me stop that share and please tell us more about that article.
Yeah, well, the Atlantic at the time was, unfortunately, they sort of discontinued it, but for a while they were trying to have a real spotlight on food related issues. And so Bill and I were invited to be contributors to that effort, and we wrote a series of articles for that, and essays really. Um, and that piece that you just mentioned was something that I've talked about in many of my talks over the years, because it kind of, again, kind of reframed the whole way that people think, I hope, about sort of food production and their consumption of food and how that impacts the environment. Because what it talked about was the fact that there's this sort of global decline in the bee population. And we know that this has been happening for a long time, but that there's also a very significant amount of pollination that happens both for domesticated crops and for, just the natural world, for all of the plants that need pollination, which is a lot, um, through from wild pollinators. Okay, and it's not just bees, but they are the most important of the wild pollinators. But there are many different types of wild pollinators, and it varies depending on where you are in the world. Um, but the article was pointing out that when you um, consider the total impact of those wild pollinators, which is significant and is even more important because of the global decline of domesticated bees from colony collapse disorder, and the causes of that are still not fully known, but are believed to mostly be related to human chemical applications in agricultural fields. Um, but the wild pollinators are really important for the success of the pollinated crops and just for ecosystem health. And when you considered where the wild pollinators are living, they're actually primarily living in those areas that are agricultural spaces that are not plowed crops. So primarily grazing lands. And so it's an interesting sort of, and actually that particular study was one done by the biology department at Berkeley, and they were actually attempting to quantify that economic impact, and it was really significant, because when you consider the sort of estimated percentage of pollination that was happening from these wild pollinators, and then you consider the total impact of the crops that they're pollinating, it was in the many, many millions of dollars. I don't remember the figure off the top of my head, but a very significant portion of that pollination was actually taking place from the wild pollinators. So it was saying, given that reality, we need to make sure that we're preserving, and they were, sort of putting a premium on preserving that habitat for those wild pollinators, and in particular, grazing lands. And California has had a lot of development pressure on its grazing areas for a very long time. And so this was part of the sort of analysis that grazing lands are important to protect. And it wasn't, this article was not talking about it, but the other aspect of that that's really important, the loss of grazing near urban areas has been a major factor in the wildfire risk. And in fact, there were some articles about it right at the time, but I haven't seen that much follow up on it. But the huge wildfires that happened in Los Angeles, recently, which are the, sort of the largest impact of wildfire that's ever happened in terms of human built landscapes and human lives and so forth. That was um, in part due to the fact that the lands around, in Southern California and near Los Angeles are not being managed in the same way. And there's a lot less grazing now than there used to be. So we know from many, many instances and tons of research around the world that grazing is a really important way to manage wildfire risks um, for urban and suburban areas as well. But the point of that article was all about the impact on agriculture. And so when you're thinking about, the argument was when you're thinking about cattle and their beneficial impact, you also have to consider that the presence of cattle is the protection of habitat for wild pollinators, and that those are important not just for the ecosystem that they're on, but also for the ecosystems that they pollinate, which are nearby fields.
And specifically, is it the type of grasses, the flowering grasses in the pastures that the bees
Well,
like?
it's always, ideal to have, and I'm sure Seth, you're familiar with Fred Provenza's book Nourishment, which I've read twice because it's such an amazing book. But whenever you're talking about pasture and rangeland, ideally you want to have as much diversity as possible in the plant life in those pastures for a variety of purposes. It's very important for the health of the animals that are grazing there, but it's also very important for ecosystem health because all of the wild animals, including the wild pollinators, will benefit from a diverse plant population in the rangelands and pasture lands.
I've heard that the almond industry has actually been devastating on bees and is contributing to the colony collapse disorder. Have you
Well,
heard
I don't
anything about
know
that?
specifically about that, but anytime you have a large monoculture, it's problematic. So, you know, um, diversity is kind of the cornerstone for, health. It's absolutely the cornerstone of health for any ecosystem. And anytime, I mean, this is really a lot of the problem with modern agriculture is so much of it is about huge monoculture. And whether you're talking about when you drive through the, Midwestern parts of the United States and you see these mile upon mile after mile and mile of, corn and soy, and that's just inherently problematic. And and that, of course, a huge portion, I think it's something like 80% of the world's almonds are now produced in California. And so you have these vast areas where you have almond trees. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with an almond orchard, that's for sure. But whenever you have an incredibly large area of any one crop, and in particular, often it's been something that, replaced something that was a more diverse, agricultural system, and then it's just a bigger and bigger system with more and more monoculture, that's going to cause problems.
Well, what what I heard is that the almond industry particularly um, relies on bees,
Oh yeah, that's for sure.
and that these colonies are literally shipped in trucks around the country, specifically for the purpose of pollinating these almond fields, and
Well,
so
in fact, part of what I've heard too over the years as I've read about this is that the bees are that part of the theory of why they're struggling so much is because of the way they're trucked around
Right,
in these,
exactly.
on these semis. And yeah, and so they
Exactly.
don't have, just like every other living creature, they need to have a connection to where they're living
Yeah.
and have,
Yeah.
to be able to function in a healthful way in that space. And when you're taking an animal, a wild animal, and I mean it's a domesticated bee, obviously, but essentially one that's operating out in a a natural environment, and you're just releasing it there, and it's not familiar with that area, it's not going to be able to function in the same way that it would normally do if you compare the way a domesticated bee lives in an industrial agricultural system like that with the way a bee would normally live in in a particular environment, and they literally know where every single flower is that they get as a food source for that hive. um, and I have a couple of books in my bookshelves about bees, and I'm sure we've all seen these kinds of things. They have actually photographs of the bees doing very intricate little dances. I mean, I think that's the right term for the other bees about where a specific source of food is located. It's
Right.
quite extraordinary what they're able to do. But so to be able to imagine how are they capable of functioning like that if they're being trucked around in the back of huge semi trucks, it's not going to be able to work the same way.
Right, right, exactly. So, um, it's just interesting talking about bees because, um, a lot of people in the plant forward or whatever you want to call it community and sort of pushing back against meat and dairy really turn to almond milk. And almond milk is a big thing, yet the ecological footprint on industrial almonds is horrifying, particularly if you consider it from the perspective of what's happening to bees and
Well,
colony collapses and
it's
all.
also very water intensive. So there's a lot of information about the ecological impact of almond production. And it is also a bit ironic because if you're a vegan and you're relying on almond milk, that's entirely reliant on the bees, as you just said. And they, depending on who what level of vegan you are, most vegans agree that they feel that you should not use bees at all. You shouldn't consume honey because it's a product of, an animal. I mean, I don't subscribe to this at all, but if you read through their own writings and their own, communications, and they talk to them, they'll explain why they're opposed to the, bees being part of any agricultural system. But as you point out, they are eating, or drinking the product that's requiring the participation of the bees. And that's also true, by the way, the organic vegetable farm in town and right here where I live, but it's also true all over the country, is heavily dependent on chicken manure. So, there's a lot of,
Mm-hmm.
contradiction within the kind of
Mm-hmm.
absolutist perspective that says we
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have animals in the food system.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, very good. Well, listen, Nicolette, it's 1:43 now, which means we have 17 minutes left, and there's so many more topics I want to get to. There's never enough time, of course, um, but I'm glad to hear you talking about bees. You did mention about fire and about using animals in the understory. This topic came up just the other day in another Soul for Climate webinar, and one of the people who is on that webinar is with us in Zoom right now, Patrick Pritchard, and and the resistance, even in the ranching and ecological rangeland community, to the notion that we shouldn't be relying so much on fire. Like it's shocking how embroiled we are on still believing that fire is like the number one tool. And and Alan Savory says, look, fire is a tool,
Hmm.
but you're totally over relying on it. and you need to have animals at a much higher degree in terms of removing brush and understory. And yes, a lot of grasses are fire dependent grasses now, but that's a new thing, before humans started setting all that fire, they that wasn't necessarily the case. So what are your thoughts about the use of animals, in terms of fire mitigation?
Well, fire is something that I learned a lot about over the last few months because actually in the congressional district where um, I've been running as a candidate, there's a tremendous amount of forested area, and there was once a very, very robust forestry industry here. There still is quite a bit, but there was once much, much more. And the thing that I heard from the forestry officials that I talked to, I mean, I had literally probably dozens of hours of conversations as well as meetings with people in the forestry industry as well as or people in the timber industry and also the wood byproduct reuse industry and also people in the forest service. I had a lot of conversations with retired forest service officials. And and what I found out was that there's just an extraordinary gap in information and understanding of fire and fire risks and wildfire and forest management. And I actually hadn't fully understood until this campaign how many people in agriculture are partially reliant on timber for their own sort of ecological or economic health because um, a large portion of their land is forested, and in addition to having grazing animals and maybe some other crops, they also sell timber, periodically as part of the revenue stream of their operation. So having, you know, intelligent policies related to timber and land and forestry management is really, really important. And and what I don't claim to be an expert in it. I certainly, can't even begin to claim even a thimble full of knowledge compared to many of the people I was talking to. Um, but one thing I learned was that we, in urban settings, in places like, Sacramento and Washington, D.C., Sacramento being the capital of California for your non-California listeners, we talk about a lot of these issues in very simplified ways. So we'll say, we're all concerned about climate change, and so because of the fact that we're
Wild
really
pollinators,
worried about
and
climate
then you consider
change,
the total.
and
Sorry, go on.
there
Yeah,
was a little
continue.
bit of an echo there for a
Yeah,
second,
yeah.
I think.
No, I know that was my fault. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Continue, please.
Um, we're all concerned about climate change, and we are concerned as part of that, as sort of increased wildfire risk. And so the thing that I've heard over and over again here in the Bay Area is that wildfire risk has dramatically increased because of climate change. And that there's obviously some truth to that. But what I found out from talking to Forest Service officials is um, forest service officials is that there's a dramatic shift that's happened in the way forests are managed, and essentially they were much more intensively managed, decades ago, and now there's much more of a kind of hands-off, especially for the federal lands, and that what's happened is you have this dramatic increase in the density of the trees and in the presence of the understory, as we were talking about before. And so you don't just have sort of climate change causing wildfire risk to be, to have greater risk of fire and greater risk of much hotter fires. You actually have human management of the forest that had changed very dramatically over the last few decades, and that resulting in this much greater fire risk. And a lot of that does relate to grazing animals. It also relates to how much, tree removal is allowed. But this understory issue is a big part of it. And so now what's happening is there's a kind of a discussion about fire, as you were alluding to, Seth, where there's kind of a pro-fire and an anti-fire discussion. And it's complicated because as you said, I've also heard Alan Savory say this many times. Fire is a tool, and it's an important one. But what I've seen happen is the people who really don't like cattle in public lands, for example, and being out west here, that's where most of the cattle are actually is on public lands. Um, you have the anti-public lands cattle people, the anti-cattle people for public lands saying, well, we don't need the cattle, we'll just use fire. and that and that's a kind of a ridiculous assertion, okay?
Yeah.
And so there's this strange kind of bedfellows of people that are opposed to cattle that are now pro-fire, and you also have people that are that think that they're sort of in favor of preserving the forests, who are opposed to taking down any trees in order to have sort of healthy management of the forests. So there's a lot of sort of complexity to these issues, and they get boiled down in very simple messages in the sort of urban-based environmental groups. And the more I learned about wildfires and timber, and I've realized there's a lot more human management of these landscapes that's needed, and that we're doing a lot less of it now, and that is increasing wildfire risk and intensity, and that's a problem.
And Patrick is writing in the chat area, more boots on the ground, and that topic also came up in a previous webinar. He also asked about how you see holistic management, working into all this, both like specifically, but also even at a higher level. And I noticed you have a very nice quote from Alan Savory in the back of your first edition of Defending Beef. He writes, I hope this book, which is more about the future of humanity, will be read by every citizen. So, just real quickly, if you have any thoughts about holistic management, and then a couple other points I want to hit on before we wrap up.
Well, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. We just haven't had a kind of an overarching focus on sort of long-term ecological sustainability in so much of the way agriculture has been practiced for the last, century. And the way I view holistic man, I'm a great supporter and fan of Alan Savory, and the many other practitioners and advocates for holistic management around the world. Um, but I just think it's exactly the kind of approach that's required. We need to have more intentionality and more sort of big picture and long term kind of approaches. And I think that, the people I've met for the last 25 years working on agriculture and in, sort of all of these professions where they're working with the land and with water and with, whether it's oyster farming or fishing or ranching, those are the people who have the greatest knowledge of the resource. And so to me, what I like about holistic management, and especially what the Savory Institute has done over the years, is to try to really work with the people in that community and have them um, take their knowledge of the resource and helps them to develop it into this more sort of planning and longer term thinking about how to manage the resource for long term sustainability. So I'm a big fan, and I think we need just more and more of it, basically.
Absolutely. Thank you. I concur. And I've always wondered, how can we get these groups of politicians or stakeholders um, just to create a holistic context? I mean, I think that in itself would be a major breakthrough. So maybe at another time, we can talk about how to do that. And in the meantime, I just want to do a quick share here because we do have to wrap up soon. I'm now sharing directly from the browser, so just folks can see this is your product page on Amazon. So if people want to go to Amazon to get any of your books, I see The Righteous Porkchop is available in the Kindle edition now, so that's cool. And then put in a plug for my own organization, Soil for Climate. We're trying to raise money for our regenerative grazing efforts on Maasai lands in Kenya and Tanzania. And I'm actually going to drop that link into the Zoom chat. Um, where the heck is it now? Oh, Lord help me. Okay, well, maybe when I stop. Oh, here it is. Here's chat. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to drop that link into there. People want to make a little donation to Soul for Climate. We really would love it. You know, we're a small nonprofit, but we're grabbing a big mission here, and trying to work with Maasai communities in Kenya and Tanzania specifically to do holistic planned grazing. And then also just the last thing about the movie Groundswell, which just came out. Um, Really exciting. Like I really feel like that's changing the communication around this topic. And we only have a few minutes left, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts you wanted to add to that.
Well, I agree with you about, I mean, I had a chance to watch the film as well, Groundswell, and I just thought it was just beautiful. And I love the way they're such good, Rebecca and Josh are such good filmmakers and such good storytellers. And I love the way it's, told in such a sort of visually appealing way, and it's very user friendly for someone who doesn't really know anything about this topic. So I think it'll be great for classrooms and for a general audience to try to draw more and more people into this movement, because it really is something, because we're talking about food production primarily. I mean, also there's fiber and other things, but primarily we're talking about food, and that's something that every single human is connected to. So we have a way to talk to everyone and to connect with everyone, literally every person on the planet, um, about this topic. And I feel like we've come such a long way, as we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, we've come such a long way in the last couple of decades in terms of how people are thinking about their food. And there's much more understanding that it relates to environmental health, that it relates to human health, that we're not just mindlessly, I remember when you and I were kids, that there was so much talk about, oh, at some point they'll just basically give you a tablet of nutrition and you won't even have to eat anymore. And it's like, like that was something good. I think, I think we've moved away from that. I think we've kind of moved back to the recognition that eating matters, cooking matters, eating together matters. There's so much community around food production, but also food preparation and food consumption, and just that eating good food is one of the greatest joys in life. And I went for many years without eating meat, and when I started eating meat again, I realized not only was it providing me so much nutrition, but it was actually reconnecting me to the food of my childhood, and the food that my mom used to make, and make cooking the recipes that she used to cook in our kitchen and that I used to help her with, um, has just been such a wonderful enhancement to my life. And I'm so glad to be back in the fold of omnivorous eating and eaters. But just eating together is one of the greatest pleasures in life. So I think we have an opportunity, and movies like Groundswell are part of that, connecting with everyone and helping people to think about and understand how they can participate in this movement through the choices that they're making every day when they choose what to eat.
Totally. I completely agree. I think it was very smart of them to have the movie sort of focused around food and agriculture and not just climate. And, it's interesting because I got into this from climate. I was
Yeah.
what you might call a traditional climate activist. And then I discovered soil and then regenerative agriculture and the role of food. So um, it's we all have our own little paths,
Yeah.
but absolutely, eating like an organic apple and a free range chicken, and I like to have some fruit uh, with meat at dinner, and the crunchy snappiness, the sweetness of the fruit, and then the nice savoriness of the meat. It just obviously just your body, your deep intuition says yes. You know, this is what the body needs. So we are wrapping up now. Any sort of last thought in terms of a sort of an action item? What's your next action item, and what are you recommending for people for action items for them to consider?
Well, I still believe, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, that we need a lot more attention within the national political dialogue and also statewide. So I think whenever we're involved, each of us are involved in any kind of um, political, for example, if you attend a candidate forum in your community for, whether it's for state assembly or for the Congress, I think it's a really good idea to use that opportunity to ask a question about or to bring up when you speak directly to the candidate, bring up this point that you consider the food system and the way we're raising food to be a really important part of ecological health and human health, and just to keep kind of bringing this in front of people at every opportunity, because I really believe the consumer and the general public is a lot farther along in the journey of thinking about this than people, you know, in the halls of policymaking. And so we kind of got to drag them along, and bring them into the conversation and say, you need to be at this table because you're not there and you should be.
Right, very good. Okay, and then maybe the quote unquote the table could be a holistic management context setting session. Yeah, those settings are not complicated. They're just basic questions. How do we want the world to be? Um, and uh, and you can then have a second meeting, where you talk about, livestock or whatever. But even the first meeting, just to create the context of the kind of world that you want.
Well, and
Um,
I think this idea, we get so into silos in our, in our language and in our, I mean, even if you go to, try to get medical care nowadays, you're rarely dealing with someone who has a lot of knowledge of a lot of different parts of, human health. You're kind of dealing with someone who's looking at your foot or who's dealing, whatever. It's always you're kind of rooted into a specialty right away. And so they found more and more in the practice of medicine that people are so specialized now that they don't know very much about the general practice of medicine. So we're kind of having to return to more knowledge of the connectedness of the human body and how the human body is a system. And that's what, functional medicine is all about, which I really appreciate. And whenever we're talking with any kind of person in the public policy sphere, we need to encourage this holistic thinking and thinking about how things are connected and how human health is connected to what we're eating, but how what we're eating is also related to agriculture, and how so all these things are connected, and not just these things, obviously, whether it has to do with, I mean, I have all kinds of things I'm always thinking about, whether it relates to light, the sources of light, and what kinds of light we're getting, and how does that relate to mood and health. And, there are just so many topics that we all are hearing about all the time. But these things we need to think about how to have healthy systems and how humans can be part of those healthy systems, and be thinking less about individual issues like climate change in a kind of an isolated way, and forgetting how it's connected. So for me, the sort of takeaway key message is systems thinking and thinking about how everything is connected. And I think that's the cornerstone of regeneration,
mhm,
is
mhm,
thinking about systems and thinking about how things are connected and how different parts of the system support each other,
mhm,
and how we want to foster healthy systems rather than thinking of issues in isolation.
Absolutely. Well, God bless that. I think that's a good signing off time. Please feel free to tap me on the shoulder if you want to do another webinar, and just
Thank
get
you.
more back into any of these topics generally, or drill down a little more specifically about something.
Great. Thank you, Seth. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, Nicolette, it's a pleasure to have you as well. And this was recorded to the cloud, and I'll just send out the link with the passcode that Zoom gives me. I'll just send it along so anyone can just download the whole thing, and it's also streaming into the Soul for Climate Facebook group, so it will be there for about 90 days. So if Facebook doesn't keep permanent copies anymore of stuff that's streamed, but you have plenty of time to see it. Okay,
I'll
thank
make
you.
sure to share it. Okay.
Thank you again, Nicolette. Good and
Thank
good luck
you.
with everything. Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye
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 bye.
bye.